examples. Good, good. It's on the web, and there's multiple versions. I had one person ask, is there any specific version you want me to read? No, any of them actually. Are some of them better than others? Probably, but how do you judge that? You know, it's I think, very difficult. If you're looking at a relatively new book with a new translation, that's not going to be on the internet because you have to pay for that because it's still under copyright. What you'll find on the internet, for the most part, unless it's an illegitimate site, should be older translations that are no longer copyright, so they're public domain, right? Pretty easy. But I mentioned Monday that Apollo is the god that he's basically blaming his problems on. Chaerephon goes to the Delphic oracle and asks the priestess, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the priestess says, no. Sorry, that's my impression of what that must have been like. And comes down thinking, Socrates, the God has said no one is wiser than you are. And so, as he explains, as a result of this, he goes around asking questions of all the famous people who are famous because they're so wise, and he wants to find out who's wiser than him. Because he figures, I'll find this wise person, and I'll go back to the God and I'll say, you said I was the wisest, but look, I found Joe Snuffy, who's clearly way wiser than me, so what do you say to the God? I don't know what you would say to the God in that case, right? So he does go around to all these different people. Which people does he approach? There's three different groups. And did you catch it? So the poets, goes to the poets. They're so famous, they write such great poetry. Well, it turns out that when he asked the poets about writing poetry and what they know, it turns out that they're great poets, but they really don't know diddly squat about anything else. So they're not really wise. And he goes to the sophists, the teachers, the wisdom teachers. They're famous for being wise. So he asks them, what, is virtue? What is, whatever. And it turns out that, they're famous for being great teachers, and they collect a lot of money from rich people to teach the sons of the wealthy. But it turns out that they really don't seem to be wise either. And what's the third group? I can't remember offhand what the third group is. But he asks a third group, and the third group is same deal. The writer, I guess the ones who write the plays, maybe was the third group, and they're famous for things. And in fact, it turns out that the same thing happens. They're famous for being wise, but as far as he's concerned, they're no wiser than anyone else. But that doesn't mean that he ends up concluding that he is the wisest person. Although, depending on who you listen to, their interpretation is that he does, or not. Well, but what does he conclude? That no one is wise. Only the gods are wise, basically. So who knows exactly what he really intended by that. But he does have the famous line that critiques all those who thought they were wise. They don't know anything. I know I don't know anything, and therefore I know more than they do. Because I know enough that I don't know anything, so I'm not going to make a fool of myself by acting like I know something when I really don't. Probably not a good idea to tell the world, I can't believe so-and-so had secret, documents at home. What a mistake. How horrible. And then, of course, he's got documents in his office, in his house, in his garage with his Corvette. I mean, that's... Maybe you shouldn't have done that. Yes?
So, if Socrates didn't write anything, like he just asked and talked to people, right? But Plato, like, wrote the Socrates. So how we determine like which one is Plato's point of view and which is Socrates' point of view? It could be like the main character could be like showing the Plato's point of view.
You're absolutely right. We don't know that. How could we tell? What the tradition says is that Plato's dialogues go through 3 different periods. The first period, the earliest one, Socrates, the Apology, and a few other dialogues where Socrates keeps asking questions and doesn't know the answers himself. And another example of this would be the Euthyphro, for example. Let me go up to the Euthyphro for a minute. So this one is between Socrates and Euthyphro. And I use this one as an example of the early period, but also why Socrates is in so much trouble. Because Euthyphro, and if you think about it, EU is the prefix for good, Theo is a word for God, and Phro is phronesis or analysis. So it's good God analysis, basically, right? And Euthyphro is there as his role is a priest. And they're in line at the court Basileus in order to Socrates is there for his trial, but Euthyphro is there. Why? He's going to charge his father with murder of one of his servants. And Socrates decides to get into a discussion with him, and since he's a priest, Socrates explains, well, I'm charged with not being pious. You being a specialist in piety, perhaps you can teach me what being pious is all about. Because obviously here I am, 70 years old, not being very pious. It's hard to teach an old dog new tricks, etc. In any case, would you teach me what it means to be pious? And you, of course, no problem. And so they basically get into this discussion, and Socrates asks, what is piety? And Euthyphro's answer is, doing what the gods love. That's what's pious. All 2,000 of them. Yes, that's a problem. If you read about the Greek gods and various mythology, etc., you end up discovering that the gods are very human, fighting with one another all the time, breaking one another's rules, etc. They're not really very ideal examples of being a god. And so it ends up pretty easy for Socrates to get into a situation where, well, if I'm being pious for Zeus, Hera is going to be mad at me. And if I'm pious for Hera, Zeus won't think very much of me, So how can I be pious to all these different conflicting gods? And Euthyphro is confused, doesn't really have an answer for that. This seems like a brand new critical approach to all of these gods, right? And Euthyphro, as this example, doesn't have a good answer for this. So Socrates helps, and he rephrases the question to make it clear for Euthyphro. And he asks, is the pious because the gods love it? Or do the gods love the pious because it is so pious? You get it? This is like, wow, head exploding question, because if the pious is pious because the gods love it, then the gods have determined what piety is. And so the priests telling us what the gods love are the ones that we have to listen to learn what is pious, because they have this direct insight from the gods. Although, remember, Julian Jaynes argues that they're basically psychotic. So why are you going to listen to them, right? On the other hand, if the gods love the pious because it is so pious, that means the pious is pious irrespective of what the gods like, unless they like the pious. This is still a connection, I suppose. But that also means we could try to figure out what piety is apart from the priest telling us. You had a question?
I was going to ask if the gods love something so pious that when they think what was pious better than the gods, that's what they're paying. They have the most attention towards.
Well, my quiz question for you today is actually exactly this kind of issue. Hypothetically, Jesus comes to your door. It's Jesus. And you know it's him. You have no doubt it's him. And, this is hypothetical, you know he is God. And Jesus says to you, sell everything you have, give the money to the poor, and come follow me. My quiz question for you is, do you go with him? Do you do that? Or do you argue with him? Ask him questions? In other words, are you a good American and say, I'm going to think for myself, thank you? Is it fish and chips? From here on in, what about the baby? And all this stuff that I have for the baby, that's going to be hard walking down around the cook inlet with the stroller, the bag, there's all kinds of good problems there. So please email your response to that question. And theoretically, it's a live question, because if you're raised in a Christian home, you know that Jesus actually asks this question, right? And so if you're a Christian, do you drive the Bentley or sell it?
How many people they get answers back from are typically honest?
How many people email me?
Yeah, that give you that answer, give you an honest answer.
It's kind of an odd situation when I'm asking these kinds of questions and people have the liberty to email me what they're thinking. I get the impression that most people actually say what they're thinking. But, how would I know? I could check with my wife. Do you think he's telling the truth? Because men, we don't know what the heck. I realize that's a sexist way of thinking about things, but I've been a male for 71 years. And I've been in conversations with my wife and my mother, and the two of them are smiling and having a good time talking with one another. It's just so nice. And then we walk away, Donna and I, and she tells me what really happened. I didn't know. They were stabbing one another verbally, and I was like happy, I thought, they love one another. And then I walk away and find out. Did you hear your mother say that? Oh, yeah. Do you know what that means? Oh. So, sorry about that. I was raised thinking that men and women were different, and, I believed it until, actually I still do. But, that's an issue for us now. I read Judith Butler. If anyone's interested in reading Judith Butler for their term paper, she uses the definition of a performative, that our identities are performative. There's 450 different kinds of roles that we can play, and Judith Butler goes by they. So I always have to remember if anyone's talking about doing their paper on Judith Butler, they are very interested. Judith Butler. Sorry about that, but notice I'm being honest with you, even though it's probably not politically correct. My joke's probably not that good. I can tell the joke about the moth. A moth goes into a podiatrist's office. That one's okay. I don't think that one can get me in trouble with anybody, except maybe podiatrists, maybe. Or moths. I don't know. It's kind of insulting the moths.
Moths are very touchy creatures. You talk to them for a little bit and then they start screaming at you.
Science fiction, I've seen lots of them. The comics this morning, the one guy was sitting there, ever since I adopted these 2 stray cats, I've been feeling very, lethargic. And you see the 2 cats are hanging upside down. They're not cats, they're bats. And you notice that he has several puncture wounds in his neck. Comics, they're in the paper. Okay, never mind. Okay, so Euthyphro. Euthyphro can't answer that question. And he gets furious and walks off. Because how do you answer that question, right? Was it obvious to Euthyphro that was a critique of his whole sense of authority? I don't know. I don't get the impression that Euthyphro is that wise, actually, in that situation. But I also get the impression that Socrates wanted him to leave, because that way he's not going to charge his father. So he succeeded in stopping him from doing that. But here's the neat thing about that dialogue is it demonstrates just how infuriating Socrates could be, because all these people are being, especially young men, who love to come and listen to him, and then after they learn the technique of asking these questions, which there's different analyses of how this goes. You might think of it as a teaching method that people use. It might also be thought of as dialectic. The idea of back and forth. I mean, that whole process evolves through debate. In the Latin period, it's sic et non, yes and no. Our own debate team, which I highly recommend if you've got any interest in law and other opportunities after graduation, is an opportunity for you to practice multiple types of debate. And you listen to them up there, yelling and screaming and banging on the tables, etc., as they're learning all the different arguments and so on. And when they go to a debate competition, what happens is the 2 teams from the 2 universities or whatever will show up for their meet, and maybe there's 3 or 4 people or 2 people in each of the sessions, and they don't know what side of each issue they're going to have to represent. So what happens is, in preparation for these debates, they have to study the answer on both sides, right? Then they sit down, you get the question, and you find out which side you're on. You're for abortion, you're against it, however you want to do that, right? Did I slip into Tucky again? Sorry. But you get the idea. That's when, so you need to know all the arguments for both sides. So if you think about it, what's the outcome of learning debate for 3-4 years? It's learning that both sides have good arguments, right? Well, if you're in a society that doesn't like that, you're going to get in trouble, because there is an authority. You're supposed to respect that authority. Asking all these kinds of questions gets people mad at you. And Athens had just gone through a very horrible period of time where they were at war with Sparta.